Welcome to part 2 of the lecture. In this part, I will discuss why did political ecology emerge. For that, we will have to go back to some earlier studies that engage with the understanding of nature and society or nature and communities. What is the nature of understanding of the earlier perspectives in the scholarship? What kind of insights did they bring out in understanding the nature and society relationship? Because of its limitations, the way they portrayed or understood this relationship between nature and society, it is in this context that political ecology emerged. And we will look at what these earlier studies were. We will emphasize it with an classic study in anthropology, and thereby we will get an understanding of how political ecology emerged as a perspective in understanding nature and society, societal relationships. So basically, what was the reason for the shift to political ecology in understanding the relationship between society and nature? If we look at the earlier studies conducted in anthropology and sociology, these studies were highly influenced by the disciplines of science. If we look at the earlier studies conducted in anthropology and sociology, these studies were highly influenced by the disciplines of science. In other words, the concepts of biology, the concepts of physics, the concepts of systems was got into the understanding of not only society but also society's relationship with the environment. So we see the use of concepts prevalent in the science disciplines such as ecosystem, concepts of homeostasis, the idea of equilibrium, the idea of societies adapting to the environment, the idea of self-regulatory systems, the idea of adjustment and cybernetics. These were concepts or ideas that were taken from the disciplines of science and imposed onto the understanding of society's relationship with nature. Well, I mean, these perspectives portrayed a particular kind of relationship with the environment. But by and large, most of these studies were conducted on closed, bounded, isolated and subsistence-based societies. So, the earlier studies in anthropology studied indigenous communities or so-called simple societies or pre-industrial societies, and thereby understanding pre-industrial societies or indigenous communities, anthropologists and sociologists tried gaining an insight into the nature of relationship between society and the environment. What emerged in this portrayal of understanding the relationship between nature and society was that this relationship between nature and society was basically in a state of harmony or in a state of balance with the physical environment. Like, for example, concepts like cultural ecology, which was offered by the anthropologist Julian Stewart, which spoke about how societies adapt to the environment, and this process of adaptation happened by the use of technology, and thereby societies fit very well into the context of the environment. Or later on, the idea of ecosystem was brought into the context of trying to understand the relationship between nature and the environment. So these studies, which were highly influenced by concepts of science, was brought in to the context of understanding nature and environment, and these had repercussions in the portrayal of the relationship between nature and the environment. So what we saw was in these earlier studies, harmony and balance was emphasized. But perhaps the reality of societies and communities living in close proximity with nature or in relationship with nature were maybe far away from harmony and balance. And this is where we see the emergence of political ecology, because they question the very fundamental findings of earlier studies. Now, to emphasize the concepts of harmony, balance, equilibrium, cybernetics, a state of harmony, we will take up a classic study in anthropology to gain an understanding of how the earlier studies were and how they used the concepts from science to understand the relationship between nature and the environment. A classic study of the earlier portrayal of human nature relationships comes from a classic study by the anthropologist Roy A. Rappaport in New Guinea. And in a book published by him, Pigs for the Ancestors, Ritual in the Ecology of New Guinea People, we find that Roy Rappaport applies the ideas emerging from physics and systems theory in understanding the relationship between environment and society. So what Roy Rappaport was doing in this Pigs for the Ancestors, he brought in the concepts of systems theory in trying to understand the relationship between the environment and nature, but also justified the place of rituals in mediating the relationship between the environment and people. Therefore, rituals had the role of a regulatory mechanism whereby the relationship between the human population and the environment was brought in a state of balance. So what we see is he applied the systems theory similar to what is known as a thermostat in the context of a water heater or a geyser in regulating the temperature of the water. So what happens in the context of a water heater is when the temperature begins rising, a mechanical device known as thermostat gets activated, thereby cutting the power supply and restating the system back into a balance, or it cuts the power supply and therefore prevents the water from heating or going beyond a boiling point, and thereby the system is brought back into a state of balance. This principle was taken from systems theory, what we call feedback loops or cybernetics, and applied to the understanding of the relationship between society and nature. So in the context of the Sembaga Maring, who are primarily shifting cultivators who own pigs in the context of New Guinea, and the population of people was 200 on the whole, what Roy Rappaport reports is as the populations of the pig would increase, this would result in quarrels between the members, and this would lead to an annual festival or a ritual which pigs were sacrificed to appease the ancestors. In other words, the ritual commemorated the sacrificing of pigs, and this resulted in bringing the populations of the pigs down, or in other words, there was a balance in the population of pigs and the resources available in the environment. So what we find is that what Roy Rappaport was talking about in the context of Pigs for Ancestors is that a sense of balance was maintained, and ritual played the role of balancing the population of the pigs and the resources available in the environment. So thereby, what emerges from this insight is that people through these mechanisms were living in harmony with nature. Therefore, when pigs' populations increased, they were ritually killed or sacrificed, and therefore the pigs' population was prevented from exceeding a particular threshold which would lead to the exploitation or deterioration of the resources. And thereby, Rappaport was emphasizing was that there existed a harmony in the ecosystem, or there was a balance in the ecosystem. Taking the ideas from systems theory, he portrayed the community of the Sembaga Maring in relation to the environment as living in a state of balance. So what we find in the case of Roy A. Rappaport was the Sembaga Maring were portrayed as an isolated community. It was a bounded community living in harmony and balance in their relationship with the environment. And this was just a classic study in the context of how earlier studies were carried out. So the earlier studies emphasized the idea of balance and harmony in understanding this relationship between the environment and society. This portrayal of harmony and balance, as Roy Rappaport talks about in Pigs for the Ancestors, portrays a particular relationship with the environment. The question that arises is, are really societies in the real world living in harmony with the environment? Or is there a sense of balance between the environment and the populations or the communities? This idea of balance and harmony and equality between resources, the environment and people was challenged by the anthropologist Eric A. Wolff in a study in 1982, and the book was called Europe and the People Without History. In this work, Europe and the People Without History, Eric Wolff brings out the idea of inequalities that exist in the nature of relationship between environments and societies, and therefore he also challenges the very idea of isolation, bounded communities or communities living in the world. But actually what he portrayed was that it is in this context that we see that by the emergence of European colonialism and colonies, this impacted livelihoods to a great extent in the colonized territories, and therefore colonialism and the spread of colonies and through conquest and control of different parts of the world led to inequalities, and the so-called isolated local communities were actually integrated into larger world systems. In other words, the processes of colonialism were actually interfering the relationship between communities and the environment or nature. What colonialism did was it impoverished the lives and environments of indigenous and peasant communities. It exploited resources on which communities were dependent, thereby altering the relationship between people and the environment. So what was actually happening in reality was not societies living in a state of balance. They were the processes of world systems or colonialism playing out in the context of indigenous communities and their relationship with the environment. So what Wolff was emphasizing was this integration of isolated, so-called isolated simple societies were actually integrated into a larger world system where exploitation and inequalities and conflicts were emerging, because resources were taken, people were losing resources, and that was leading to the context of conflicts in order to prevent the larger exploitation or further exploitation of resources through the process of colonialism. So what we actually saw in reality was not societies living in harmony and balance, but disintegration, inequalities, conflicts. And therefore communities were also not isolated but entangled into larger modern world systems. So what we find in the context of reality was not of harmony and balance, but imbalances and inequalities playing out. And this is where Wolff study can be located within the context of a political ecological perspective, because what Wolff was emphasizing was that these larger processes of colonialism was intervening in the relationship between societies and nature, and it was moving away from the very overtly simple analysis of isolated communities. So actually, in reality, there were no isolated communities because they were integrated into larger world processes or larger economic and political processes of the globe. And therefore, what Roy Rappaport and the earlier studies were emphasizing on harmony and balance between environments and societies, Wolff's study was emphasizing that no, it was actually inequalities and conflicts that were emerging by the processes of colonialism, by the process of exploitation, and this is all backed by the process of capitalism. So in other words, what Eric Wolff's study from a very political ecology perspective brought out that larger processes were impacting local communities, and the relationship between the environment and communities was undergoing large scale change, and this was something which was overseen by the earlier studies. Henceforth, what we need to take back from what we just discussed was that the idea that the reason why political ecology emerged was because of the shortcomings in the earlier studies that tried to engage with the understanding of the environment and communities or societies in understanding that relationship, because political ecology emerges with a very different perspective of critically looking at the relationship between environment and society, and how larger political and economic processes impact local communities, their livelihoods, their various political systems, their religious systems, or culture itself that was undergoing change in the context of colonialism. So political ecology as a perspective takes on a very critical role in looking at the relationship between nature and society and the various processes that intervene in mediating this relationship. So Eric Wolff's work is located in the political ecological perspective, thereby bringing out the limitations in the perspectives offered by earlier scholarship. So that is why since 1970s we see that political ecology emerges as a very prominent interdisciplinary perspective in trying to understand the relationship between the environment and society. What is central to Eric Wolff's perspective is that capitalism and globalization are to be seen very critically, and they are both very exploitative processes or systems that have their own interest in exploiting resources at the cost of depriving local indigenous peasant communities. So therefore these processes are problematic. And I quote Carlson, who says, capital accumulation and political economy more generally provide the overall framework for understanding such instances of dispossession and displacement of local communities by global forces of state and market. Therefore, what Carlson is emphasizing is that capital accumulation of not only wealth but of resources and the political economy is the larger framework by which local communities are stripped of their own resources and pushed to the brinks of impoverishment. And these processes are fueled by the process of capitalism and globalization, and this needs to be critically analyzed and looked into in understanding the relationship between environment and society, which is otherwise portrayed in a very simplistic manner as that societies are living in harmony and balance with the environment. So political ecology questions the earlier perspectives, but also offers an alternative frame of looking at the relationship between environment and a society. So basically what political ecology is doing, that it is offering a critical study on the unequal access and control and outcomes of the lives of people as well as the environment. This unequal outcomes which play out in the context of people and the environment is what political ecology is really interested in, and that is where it is very critical of trying to understand this relationship that is not so simplistic as it is made to appear in the scholarship which was available. Therefore, we find that political ecology asks for, if there has to be a better relationship between nature and society, the democratic process should have a larger place for nature. In other words, nature should have political representation in democratic forums. The relationship between environment and society has to be strengthened or made better. Henceforth, there has to be, in the political process, nature has to be brought in more prominently, and the emphasis has to be on talking about these processes by which nature is exploited, thereby depriving local communities, peasant communities, indigenous communities, or nomadic societies. Therefore, nature should have a political representation in various democratic forums for a better relationship between nature and